Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming at you again for another edition of Film Fanatic live on the old YouTubes. Hope everyone's doing good. It's Thursday at 9:30. So, yeah, I always usually like to give a shout out and thank you to people supporting this channel. It's been growing a little bit each week, more and more, a little bit each day. So it's been really cool. I've been lately. I've been trying to focus on movies that I haven't gotten to, but I've been wanting to. I kind of always have like an informal list of movies that I want to bring to the table. I always like. Well, it's kind of funny, but one of the things that I try to keep track of is are the films that I do cover. The majority of these movies that I do, pretty much 98% of the movies that I do for this channel are all from my personal collection. They're all movies that I own on Blu-ray or DVD or VHS, predominantly on Blu-ray, especially with this channel. So one of the things that I do, I I have to obviously keep track uh, of certain movies that I've done, certain movies that I want to explore and do a show on. I have to always keep that in check. And then I do also do like these specialty shows. I've been doing, I've done a few shows where I just talked about specific directors, or I do the interview segments. I did a few shows of where I focused on certain films that were commercially when they came out, they were big bombs, and then they eventually went on to find this really big cult following, and now they're regarded as classics. So I try to mix it up, with those things. And I also, when I go to the movies, which I wish I went more often, I still go. It's funny when I think of how different things are, but I used to go to the theater quite a few years ago, probably like 10 years ago, which is hard to believe. I used to go to the movie theater every week. I had a little group of friends at the time. That whole group of friends is like everybody's kind of split up now, and everybody's kind of moved all over the state and kind of lost connection with some of those guys. But at one point, we had a little core group of friends, and I remember every week, Thursday, there's a local paper here in Maine called the Free Press, and it's a little local paper, and it used to always have a cool movie section in the newspaper, in the paper, and it would be they would have like there was a guy who used to write reviews for movies, which was really cool, and he was pretty good. He was pretty spot on, pretty fair, but he would review lots of newer movies that were coming out, but then also movies that were coming to DVD at the time. And then they would do a lot of coverage of all the new movies that are coming out that week in the local theaters, like the Colonial Theater in Belfast, which is now closed, the Strand in Rockland, which is still going, but it's still a movie theater, but they do lots of other things, with music and various other forms of art. And then they also have the one thing that's very different about it too is when they do have films, they have these really short runs, so they don't really have them in rotation for a long time. So it's really easy to miss a movie there. I haven't seen a movie there in at least 3 or 4 years. Um, and then, yeah, flagship cinema. Like I mentioned, they had 12 at that time. They had, I think it was like maybe 12 theaters. So they always had movies constantly coming through, and then they would always have the movies in rotation for like weeks, sometimes a month. So there was like just locally there was tons of choices as far as what movies you wanted to go see. Usually, like for me, like the Colonial Theater would be the for like big budget Hollywood movies. I would go to the Colonial Theater, and also Flagship. They would show a lot of the bigger releases, the bigger budget Hollywood films. The Strand had that also, but they would tend to show a little bit more of films that would be quote unquote called like art house films. And then there was also, I forgot too, there was also another movie theater in Camden called Bayview Cinema, which was an amazing theater, and that closed quite a few years ago. Oh, she's probably like 8 years ago now, which is hard to believe. But I forgot about that. There was also Bayview Cinema in Camden, which was an awesome theater. That theater showed. They had a really cool variety. They would show. I remember going there to see the Lord of the Rings movies. I remember going to see Ang Lee's Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. That's how long ago this was. It's just crazy. They had a whole. They would show fairly large big Hollywood movies, but they also showed tons of independent films. I remember going there to see some Woody Allen movies. Awesome theater. My two favorite theaters. My favorite theater at that time to go to was the Colonial Movie Theater. And particularly, they had this one theater called the Dreamland, which was a theater downstairs, and it was actually in a real theater with a stage, and it had that theater always had this rich history to it, and it was a really you felt like you were. I always got that feeling going there, like you were going to see like a concert because it was like you're really going into this space that felt unique. And that was usually my go-to. Every movie that would come out that were the bigger budget films, and it was also a little bit before a lot of the Marvel movies came out, but some of them had come out, I believe, at that time. That was my destination. I used to always look in the paper, the free press, like I said, to see what was playing at the Colonial. And they would have, when they would show, well, like for instance, I remember going to see the first Iron Man now there with Robert Downey Jr., which was one of the first Marvel movies, and I was so excited to see that. Huge Iron Man fan, and I went to see it in Dreamland, and it was just an amazing experience. But I remember being, all giddy. Like every week, the free press would come out, and there'd be, so many choices of all these movies to check out. And that little group of friends that I had mentioned before, they were, we were all kind of, we were definitely like nerd. We were all pretty much nerds about movies, and they were really into gaming and stuff and music. But they were it was a cool little group of friends, and we would go to the movies a lot, and every week it was like every Friday or Saturday we would go, and it was super fun. If we couldn't do it on a Friday night, we would usually go to like a matinee, because there was, like, again at that time, to go to a movie, not only were there was a whole bunch of theaters to choose from, but the options to see the movies, the times and the showings, there was a whole bunch of options. So it was like a regular, you know, weekly occurrence. And I remember every Thursday when the free press would come out, I would actually get really excited, and I couldn't wait to get the paper to look at it and to read what was coming out. And it was a great time, but now things are completely different as far as that goes. Now, really, the only regular theater around is Flagship. Bayview's been closed for a very, very long time. Colonial's closed. Um, and the Strand is still open, but they have very limited runs for films, and it's hard to get there schedule wise a lot of the times. Um, so it's very different. It's very different, and it's kind of sad. So now when I go to the movies, it's always at Flagship, but now they only have like four theaters in their at their place. So and the other thing is they they don't seem to have the films run as long. As far as like they'll have a film that might have say like 10 years ago. So I don't know. First, it's like say like I brought up Iron Man. That would have probably have been running in that theater for say like 3 weeks to a month. Maybe more. And you had late shows, you had matinees to choose from, and weeknights, weekdays, a plethora of choices for times. Now it's like there's like there's no more late. They have no more night or late shows at the Flagship. They've done away with late shows. They do have matinees, but they're pretty limited. They do it on Saturday and Sunday, but they're pretty limited when they do that. And then the other thing is, it seems like now when they have a movie there, it's only there for like a week or two. So it's very different. So I don't get to go to the movies nowhere as near as I would love to. I really miss that. That was a very magical time to be a film fan. The last movie I saw at Flagship, geez, oof, what the hell was it? I'm trying to think. Um, Man, it was yeah, no, it was Avatar. Avatar 2. James Cameron's Avatar 2. No, actually no, I take that back. I did see that when it came out in December. Here we are in February already, 2023. Crazy. Yeah, Avatar, I saw that around it was around Christmas time. And the last movie I saw was Deadly Night, which was an awesome movie. And I saw that, yeah, I saw that maybe a couple weeks after Avatar. I saw it like the week or two after Christmas. So it's been, it's probably been a month, 2 months since I've been to the theater. And, both those movies were great, especially uh, Deadly Night. Like, that was an awesome movie. Avatar was really good too, but Deadly Night was next level. That was definitely one of the best movies. So the other thing that I do is I usually, aside from the regular reviews that I do shows on movies that I have seen in the theater, and I usually do them the day after I've seen them, just because I like to have the movie kind of resonate with me sometimes. Sometimes I'll be really excited and I'll do the show at the same time or the same day. But I usually like to let the movie kind of process, and then I'll do a show on it. But it's pretty sporadic when I do that. But I I do reviews on brand new films, and then also movies that I've seen on DVD or Blu-ray that have just come out. But still the majority, like 98% of the videos I do is all focused on movies that I own. So it's funny, sometimes I get a little bit sidetracked, and I usually, when I do these videos, I always have a plan or a particular, like I'm always thinking of a list of movies that I want to get to or that I need to get to. And then usually I make the day of, like this morning or yesterday, I'll think of, okay, I'm gonna do this movie, and I don't usually plan it out too much. It's a little bit more it's more off the cuff, but I definitely have a plan, and then I'll make like an informal list, and then I'll focus on doing that particular movie. So this is a movie that, again, I did a movie yesterday. I did a show on Wes Craven's Swamp Thing, a movie that was a real part of my childhood. I just, you know, I've always had a like a deep kind of relationship with that movie. As silly and as goofy and as campy and kind of as well as ridiculous as that movie is, I just love it. It's part of it's a nostalgic thing, but I also feel watching it now, so many years later, it it means even more to me. I've heard that happen. I've heard that being said with other folks on YouTube. I had mentioned this guy Cody Leach, who I follow a lot, and he says that one of his opinions of films that, like, when you see films at certain parts of your upbringing, or certain times of your life, obviously it really can make an impression or not. But a lot of films, that we've all grown up watching, and it's kind of out of a very nostalgic, from a very nostalgic perspective, meaning like you watch a movie that, well, like Swamp Thing, for instance, or like any of the other films that I've talked about through this channel, um, the Friday 13th franchise, or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, uh, more so with Friday 13th, because I didn't see Texas until much later. But and then a film like um, House by the Cemetery, Lucio Fulci, movies that I grew up watching, and they were just kind of, they had a lot to do with my introduction to all things horror, and I saw it at an impressionable age, and it stuck with me. Another other movies that I've talked about on this channel that are very much a part of that: Tourist Trap, The Car, uh, you know those particular kinds of films, those exploitation films, were just a part of my youth, and watched them watched those films over and over again growing up. But one of the things Cody Leach sometimes talks about in his channel, and again, it's something I really disagree with in a lot of ways, is a lot of the times he'll go after, or kind of trash a lot of those films, because he'll what one of the things he'll say is, like, he has a group of friends or people that he knows that are that are, say, very much into those exploitation movies from that period, or movies that they just grew up on. So that's really why they're excited, and that's really all that it's based on. Like, their enthusiasm for their films is just based on their experience as a kid watching these films. But he felt like, well, if you remove that, you know, and you just watch it as an adult, those films are more or less unwatchable. They're just terribly dated, and they don't hold anymore. They don't hold the same. They don't carry any weight to them. In the modern age, they just seem really dated, and kind of dismissible. And he talks a lot about those particular films, meaning that, like, well, if you grew up with those films, that's why you like them. They don't, outside of that, they don't really carry anything, or they don't really have any depth, or like real entertainment value, because they're dated. So he talks about not really liking a lot of those films because he didn't grow up with them. And again, that's something I totally disagree with, because for me, the experience I've had around that has been is totally opposite of that. A lot of these films that I've been revisiting, and that I've been buying on Blu-ray, and that I've been seeing again and living with again, I find myself now, being older, loving the films even more. especially too, the probably the main reason that I find myself loving the films even more is like, a film like say The Car or The House by the Cemetery or say like The New York Ripper, another amazing Lucio Fulci movie. Movies that I grew up on, but watching them now, in these like on Blu-ray, with these amazing, beautiful editions of these films, and then also comparing it to say when I was a kid, watching it on kind of crappy VHS tapes. A lot of the times they were, not the transfer was terrible. Pretty much 100% of the time, a lot of the transfers of a lot of those exploitation movies was not very good. And then also seeing those films on cable where there'd be commercials or sometimes those films would be even edited more. But watching those classic films now, watching them with just immaculate sight picture, like where they're remastered from the original negative, it's a whole new experience. So that's one of the reasons for me I love them even more, even on a from a technical perspective. They've really gotten those kinds of a lot of these obscure films have just gotten just you know world class treatment, and it's amazing that that has happened, and there's been some kind of I don't know revolution around it. It's pretty interesting. I've seen that happen, and I've seen that come up in different interviews where I've talked about or where I've like listened to people talk about that age of VHS. When you had or those three kind of stages of where you had the grindhouse cinema, the drive-in movie theaters, and particularly like in New York in the 70s and 80s and 42nd Street, and then the emergence of VHS, and then eventually DVD, and then eventually Laserdisc, and then and then now Blu-ray, 4K, all those kinds of things, and that kind of evolution. And the quality, were a lot of those companies that were well, like one big company, one probably the best example, one of the first companies that kind of really capitalized on the whole VHS, which at the time was a revolution, like from a technological standpoint. Vipco. Vipco was a British company that was run by Michael Lee, and they were one of the first companies that took those movies and released them on VHS. A lot of those exploitation movies, all the classic Italian exploitation movies, all the classic American slasher movies, all things from the 70s and 80s and even before, 60s even. They were Vipco. They were the first company, pretty much as far as from what I gather, that ushered in that new kind of era, and suddenly people were able to, because when you had the grindhouse cinema and you had the drive-in movie theater thing that was going on, you would pay your ticket and go see a movie, and it would like say, for example, like you would go in and maybe say one of the movies you could see would be Herschel Gordon Lewis's Blood Feast, or you know the New York Ripper, Lucio Fulci, and you would pay your ticket and go see it, and the ticket prices were ridiculously cheap, and you would see it on a bill with a bunch of other films, usually a lot of other grindhouse films or exploitation films, or they'd be mixed in with lots of foreign films. But you'd see it, and that would be the only way you could see it. And then, after it would run, it would have its theatrical run, it would be kind of gone. It would disappear. You couldn't see it on cable. That was the only time you could see it. It was a that period was particularly, it was definitely like a magical period because you could only see it then. And That was it. You couldn't own it, you couldn't rent it, you couldn't see it numerous times unless you paid that ticket. And then once that film went out of circulation, it would it would just disappear into kind of obscurity. But Vipco was one of the first companies that started releasing those films on VHS. But then the other thing that happened during that time was the whole video nasties list, where there was a board of all of these uh, British politicians that had a lot of money and a lot of clout that basically were, really proactively bringing about censorship. They made these lists of these video nasties, and these were all movies that they felt were disgusting and reprehensible movies that would lead kids to going out to commit murder and rape and just these films, after watching them, that they felt would lead the youth to become criminals. So the video nasties list ended up basically they ended up picking you know tons and tons of these exploitation movies and basically banning them off the market, where these movies went into obscurity and they were banned forever and you could never see them again. But then Vipco was one of the biggest companies that started. They Michael Lee, the founder of that, was able. He worked for a few different distribution companies at the time, and he had access to a lot of these films that were called the video nasties, and these were films that were banned. When I think back at that time, as crazy as things are now, things were probably worse then, where there was like proactively, and censorship was actually a thing of where you could have some kind of political organization, some religious organization, you know, attack a book or a movie or an artist and just say, well, this is vile and disgusting and amoral, so we're going to ban it, and and all these things related to the arts. It's hard to believe that was. It's hard to believe looking back, and it wasn't that long ago. You're thinking that this was like in the late '70s, '80s when these horrible things were happening, and it was censorship, and it was really accepted by lots of people. Lots of politicians got behind it. There was lots of money behind it, and it actually happened. And it's not, less than 40 years ago. Really, is when that whole thing went down. Crazy. But so Michael Lee, who started Vipco, worked, I believe, in like all of these. He worked in these various like distribution companies, and he had a machine. He was able to acquire this machine that where he could basically take he had access to a lot of these original prints of a lot of these films, these exploitation films, and he would basically copy them onto tape. And he started this company, Vipco, and they started to sell these tapes. So suddenly, like, the New York Ripper, which was considered to be, say, like a video nasty, made that list, and then it was banned for, indefinitely or permanently. Now he made a copy of it on VHS, and he started selling it through his own company, Vipco, and that led to this huge explosion. And then eventually, when that dark period ended and the video nasty thing just kind of ended, due to just people wanting to see these movies so badly, and people kind of waking up that, well, this is a horrible thing, this is censorship. All of these other companies started popping up, and then that led to the emergence of VHS, and then video rental stores. This was all like in the late '70s, but video store VHS, that kind of came about in the early '80s. And then suddenly that led to this whole revolution of where now there were all of these video shops where you could go and and rent movies rent VHS tapes, but then you could also buy them, and people were starting to trade them, and it became a huge thing, where where it was everywhere. But that also had an effect on the cinemas. It eventually killed the grindhouse scene and the exploitation scene. 42nd Street and all that particularly that magical period of where you could only see a movie that way. And but Vipco was the first company pretty much to start that revolution, and they tried to adapt. They tried to adapt to where things were going, all the way to where DVDs started to emerge, and they were around. Vipco was around, I think. Not exactly sure offhand. I think to the early, they were around for the '80s, most of the '90s, '80s, '90s, and like I think the early 2000 ish. But I think mostly in the late '90s. So about 15, or more like 10 to 12 years, they had, especially the first 10 years, they were, it was a huge company. It became a very successful company, Vipco. And then you had all these other companies doing it. And then the eventually the DVD in the 2000 ish, or actually the late 90s, that's when DVDs started to emerge, and also Laserdisc. And I've watched a couple of documentaries about Vipco, and it's a real interesting thing because when suddenly there was this huge audience and a big swell for people who loved all these exploitation movies, and they were, hardcore. They were, this cult. They were this real, you know, dedicated, hardcore fans to this particular style of cinema. There was a little bit of a backlash eventually over time, because people started, people who were real fans of a lot of these films were starting to realize that the quality of a lot of these tapes that were coming out, a lot of these VHS tapes, were terrible, and they were basically like, you know, really bad transfers from the film, and they were basically like burned copies of onto VHS, and the quality was really bad. So eventually there was this backlash against companies like that, particularly around Vipco, about, well, let's we want to see an uncut version of, say, the New York Ripper. We want to see a high quality version of it. We want to see, you know, something that really represents that movie. There was also lots of uncut versions. There was also lots of dubbed versions, films that were edited that were being released. So it was, to actually see the films in their original cut was very, very hard, even then, unless you were in the theater. And Vipco couldn't really keep up with that. And then eventually the Blu-ray thing came up, and DVD, and then suddenly there were certain companies that emerged, like Synapse, Vinegar Syndrome, where they were able to adapt to the demand, and they started releasing all of these movies where they had access to the original prints, and they were adapting to the demand by these hardcore fans to really give these movies the royal treatment. And these films were, formatted on a much better quality, in much better quality, and they also started, you know, re-releasing all of these movies, with these beautiful packages, and also spending lots of time working on, special features, and and people were wanting to see really great quality versions of these films, and kind of the rest is history. And Vipco couldn't really adapt to that demand over time, so they eventually died. But Synapse, Blue Underground, Synapse was one of the first companies that really, um, you know, capitalized on that. And now there's all these companies that are doing that on for Blu-ray and 4K. Mono Macabro, Blue Underground, Synapse, Vinegar Syndrome, Severin. And now it's like we're in the midst of this renaissance. The last, I don't know, 10 or 12 years or a little bit less. It's like amazing. If you're a collector and you're a fan of those films, you know, anything related to the exploitation world, it's amazing. Like it's unbelievable. So this is a movie again I did when I first started doing the Film Fanatic page, or I should say when I first started doing the Facebook live videos. This was one of the first movies I did. And this is Roger Corman's The Masque of the Red Death. This is definitely my favorite film from Vincent Price, the iconic face of horror. So many movies to his credit. Just, one of the most iconic figures in all things horror. And this is definitely my favorite role that he was ever in. I mean, and it's hard to say that because he was in so many great movies. Uh, just iconic. And also, I'm a huge Roger Corman fan. I feel like Roger Corman was one of the most iconic, and he's still around, but definitely one of the most iconic figures in cinematic history, particularly in the exploitation world. He did all kinds of great, amazing exploitation movies for years, with for for such little money, and he just cranked out so many movies. And and I think he's got one of the greatest legacies ever as a director. Also, he was a producer for most of his life, but he was also a really incredible director. And he directed Masque of Red Death, and there's so many films of his that I love. The Pit and the Pendulum is an amazing movie. Um, well, I should say Bucket of Blood is probably one of my favorites. He also did a version of Frankenstein. So many great movies, but he produced so many great exploitation movies. It's like the list is endless. But as a director, I think he was one of the best directors too, best directors around. Particularly in the exploitation world. But this is my favorite film of his, and it's hard to believe that this movie came out in 1964. I mean, it's just wild. Uh, so ahead of its time, and like I said, this was one of the first video when I decided to try my hat and to try this new thing with the Facebook Live videos. This was one of the first videos I did. Um, and since I started this channel, this was a movie I've been really wanting to get to and talk about more and more, with each day and each week. So I'm finally doing it today. And again, this movie, going back to like movies that I grew up watching, this was a movie that I used to watch all the time. This was always on cable um, back in the day, and I was a little kid. I remember this would always be on rotation, and I used to watch it all the time, just being completely mesmerized by this film. And also during that time, I grew up watching a lot of the British Hammer movies starring Christopher Lee. And so those films were always on television. I used to watch them all the time. They were my like introduction to horror films. So this movie has a real deep history for me. And I bought this about 2 years ago. They had just released this about 2 years ago, a remastered version of this on Blu-ray, and it is amazing. Like the transfer of this on this for this classic is just unbelievable. Um, the other thing too, why this is such a classic for me, is it's based on an Edgar Allan Poe story, which probably everybody knows out there. And Edgar Allan Poe was literally the first figure that I came across, or writer, that literally introduced me to horror. I was in, and I remember the time period like it wasn't that long ago, but I remember I think I was a yeah I was a freshman in high school, and I had this English class, and I remember my teacher at the time had, gave us, it was one of the first kind of projects she had given us, and it was a writing project where we had to like pick a writer, pick an author, and then choose one of their books or one of their short stories and basically write a paper on it. And I remember the teacher gave us like a whole bunch of choices. They were, there was I think there was some Sherlock Holmes stories. There were some fantasy writers, and one of them, the other option that we had to choose was Edgar Allan Poe. And I was a little kid, and I had no idea who he was. And I believe the first one I had read was the short story, or the story, The Masque of the Red Death, which was written by Edgar Allan Poe. And it was literally the first time I ever came across anything that was horror based, and I was just like, wow, like this is out of this world. And that's literally what got me into horror. And then growing up, I saw this on cable numerous times. I know I saw it on VHS, rented it, and it was just an integral part of my youth. So it's based on the probably my favorite writer of all time, Edgar Allan Poe, and he was literally the figure in my life that introduced me to horror. So I have like this deep connection to it. And watching this now, like this movie has so much more. I feel like this watching this film now has even more depth. It doesn't, I'm really initially approaching this film, or from the perspective of from real like nostalgic reasons, but I feel like this movie was so ahead of its time, and it really has. Um, it kind of holds up a mirror to a lot of the things that we've gone through. This movie, there were so many, especially when the pandemic hit, there were so many parallels with this story that it was kind of terrifying. And Vincent Price plays Prince Prospero, who is a prince, and he has amassed this like kingdom. He lives in this castle, and but there's the Red Death is a plague that is, basically wiping out all of the population in the world. And he is kind of a bastard in the film. He basically just is only thinking about himself and his like elitist friends, and he decides to throw this party, and he basically builds this environment and creates this party, and creates this world of where he thinks, that they are, impervious to this plague, and that they can basically let everybody die around them, and they can survive, and they can have this party, and be completely isolated from the peasants that are all dying. And he throws this this party, and he has all of his elitist friends, but then the, there are a few people that go to this gathering that are actually infected, and eventually everybody dies. And it's an amazing movie. Like it's so, in a lot of ways, ripped right from modern day headlines, from like what we've been going through. Um, and it deals a lot with. I mean, it's definitely a horror film, but it deals a lot with class warfare, and the wealthy elite, on how most of the time they treat the common man, and that there's this air of entitlement and elitism where they're above everything else. Um, but it's just such a timeless movie, such a timeless classic, such a timeless story. And like I said, Roger Corman has always been one of my favorite directors. Not only as a producer, where he was a real pioneer in all things exploitation, but so many amazing directors came through his camp, and in various forms. The list is like kind of ridiculous and endless. I mean, Martin Scorsese came out of his world, the great Martin Scorsese, James Cameron, um, Francis Ford Coppola, John Carpenter. It's just amazing. A whole bunch of other directors. I mean, he really shaped the filmmaking world. All of these guys that I just mentioned, like worked in various capacity with Roger Corman. And for years he was predominantly a producer, but then he also directed films. Um, just amazing, just amazing. Another director that is a lot less known, but he's one of my favorite directors, is Paul Bartel, who directed Death Race 2000 and also another movie, Private Parts, which is one of my favorite exploitation movies. And Death Race 2000 is just bonkers, and I just love that movie. But Paul Bartel is one of my favorite directors, and he's another one that came out of Roger Corman's camp. Um, just incredible. I mean, I think really without Roger Corman's vision, and and if he as a figure and as an icon in the world of exploitation, I feel like he really helped to shape what movies are now. Like when you think of James Cameron, for instance, like that's crazy. I mean, he's like commercially the biggest director on the face of the planet, and he came out of Roger Corman's camp. Just wild. And when I watch this movie, I'm just so blown away that this film came out in 1964. Like it's so timeless. To think that this movie is over 50 years old, it's just like it's insane. Some of the movies that he produced and directed, one of his most popular movies was the Little Shop of Horrors, the original one, which came out in 1960. Masque Red Death came out in 64. Death Race 2000, which is definitely one of my favorite Roger Corman movies with David Carradine. It was also the first movie that Sylvester Stallone was in. Such a great movie. The original Pit and the Pendulum, The House of Usher. One of the other big things that Roger Corman did that was really ahead of his time, I believe, was he was one of the first directors and producers to adapt, you know, to a degree, almost all of Edgar Allan Poe's stories. A lot of his short stories. The House, The Pit and the Pendulum, The Raven, The House of Usher. Uh, just amazing. And Mask of the Red Death, which is my favorite. He also was involved with and directed The Terror in 1963, Tales of Terror, The Haunted, The Man with X-Ray Eyes. Another film of his that I just so love, one of my favorites, is A Bucket of Blood. And that movie is just so amazing. He directed that. I think it's one of the best exploitation movies ever. And it's hardly, that came out in 1959. It's just like crazy. He also did Sharktopus. Uh, I mean, the list is just insane. Um, the Fantastic. Uh, he did a lot of like biker exploitation movies also. He kind of floated back and forth too. I mean, they were all exploitation movies at very, very low budget. But he did a lot of like sci-fi movies. He did a lot of monster movies. He did like biker exploitation movies. And he kind of mixed in lots of different genres under the kind of the umbrella of exploitation. Mostly due because of the production side of things. Like he was notorious for not, having very large budgets for his films. So they all had this like, super rawness to them, but just amazing. The Wasp Woman, another awesome movie, 1959. The Trip, 1967. The Tomb of Ligeia. Piranha, which is another one of his that is one of the most famous movies. That came out 78. Awesome, awesome movie. Galaxy of Terror, 1981. Another one that's really great, which is another Edgar Allan Poe classic, Premature Burial, which is another one of my favorites. That came out in 62. It's just amazing, like so ahead of his time when he was putting out these kinds of movies in the 60s, in particularly Masque Red Death. It's mind boggling. Monster in 1980, Attack of the Crab Monsters 1957, Battle Beyond the Stars, which is an amazing sci-fi movie 1980, Connoisseur 93. That's a more recent one. The Intruder in 62. It Conquered the World in 1956. Forbidden World in 82. Death Stalker in 83. Just wild. Just insane. Frankenstein Unbound is another one that he directed, and I've talked about that one. I mentioned that before. That's one of my favorite movies. I think it's one of the most interesting and kind of bizarre takes on the whole Mary Shelley Frankenstein story. Um, Not of this Not of This Earth from 1957, The Slumber 1982, uh, just Boxcar Bertha 1972, Barbarian Queen. I mean, it's just insane. Um, Chopping Mall. I mean, yeah. I mean, the list is. You could spend a whole day on just talking about all of the movies that he was involved in. It's just unprecedented. And there's a really great special features segment on this Blu-ray. There's a lot of really cool interviews. There's a really awesome, amazing interview with Roger Corman where he talks about. Uh, he kind of reflects back on this film as being out of all of the movies he's done, whether he was directing it or producing them. He kind of looks at this film as being like kind of his favorite. It had probably a little bit more of a budget compared to some of his other films. But the thing that's so amazing about this film is are the cinematography for this film. And there's all of these like long, kind of like panning shots of where when you're in Prince Prospero's castle, you get all of these beautiful shots where they're like essentially these one takes, and you really get a sense of the depth of the environment. I mean, just really amazing. Um, yeah, and definitely, I feel like too this movie definitely is like a cautionary tale. I also feel it's very much a horror film. It's very scary. Um, it's got a really great sense of I feel like paranoia around it, particularly around the plague that's in the film. And again, it's when you think that this came out in 64, I think there's a lot of like social commentary on this film, about power, elitism, class warfare, um, and how people from the top will treat people on the bottom, and how people generally treat other folks that they view as beneath them. But just an amazing film. And again, this is one of my favorite Blu-rays that I own in my entire collection. and again, like I just talked about all these Roger Corman films, and there's just so many. I mean, it's just insane. I could spend a whole 2 days just talking about all the films he was involved in. But this is, yeah, this is overall my favorite. Definitely my favorite movie he ever directed, and definitely my favorite role of Vincent Price. And again, Vincent Price, um, one of the most iconic actors ever in horror history. The list of films that he has been involved with is also just endless. It could dedicate just an entire show. I probably will do two separate shows at some point, where I'll do one on just Roger Corman and do a show on just the career of Vincent Price, because there's so much to talk about just with just with within their worlds. Like it's it merits um, to really explore that, and there's so much to talk about. But for this film, it's just so damn good. The transfer of this film, again, this was a movie I used to see on cable all the time, and then I did see it on VHS. But the transfer of this on Blu-ray is just like astounding. It's like immaculate. It's one of the best quality Blu-rays I've ever seen. It's definitely one of the greatest. It's timeless. Like it's amazing that this came out in '64. It's like it came out today. Um, but it's definitely amongst my prized possessions as far as what as far as my collection. And this came out. This edition came out about two, yeah, a little less, about 2 years ago. And I remember, for some reason, I there was a lot of time had gone by, and I had not seen this movie in a very very long time. And my friend Sean Russell, who was actually a guest on this show last year, he was an awesome guest. He was one of the first guests I had, and it was such a great show. It was about maybe 9 months ago that we did it. And he has a real great background in music, especially around like film scoring. He's worked on a lot of television shows and documentaries. But his wife Rebecca has a podcast. That's a pretty interesting podcast. And one time, uh, and she covers lots of different topics. She doesn't really uh, do too many movie segments, but this one show that she had, this one podcast, and this was like, it came out literally right during lockdown, at the height of the lockdown. Everything was shut down. She had done this podcast with Sean, and Sean was on the show, and they were talking about, because of the things that everything that was going on, they were talking about, the subject of the show, of the podcast, was like talking about, various things in horror or in science fiction that paralleled kind of what we were going through at the time, and kind of what we're still going through. And one of the movies that, and one of the stories and writers that they talked a lot about, and that Sean talked a lot about pretty much the whole time, was Edgar Allan Poe. And in particular, he was talking about the Masque of the Red Death. And I hadn't seen it in years and years and years, and it was such a great podcast. I remember talking to Sean about that, like, that was one of the best podcasts I've heard in general. Like, it was awesome. You should do that more often. And he's like, he did one other show since then with her, but just great. It was so cool, because I was like, oh yeah, Mask of the Red Death. I haven't seen that since I was a kid. Like, I literally had not seen it in years and years and years. And I'm like, I gotta see this movie. And after that podcast, it just totally rekindled my interest on it, in trying to track this movie down. And I had the hardest time finding it. It was kind of an obscure movie. I looked for it in a bunch of stores, like when I would go to Blue Moose. Vincent Price's body of work is huge, and Roger Corman's body of work is huge, but I could not find The Mask of the Red Death. It was really hard to find. And then eventually I started looking for it online, and I couldn't. There was no trace of it. It was so strange, and this was always one of the more popular films of both of their careers, and I couldn't find it. It was kind of in this weird obscurity, and then 6 months or so after me looking, I came across this article where they said that they were going to be there was going to be this new like collector's edition, brand new collector's edition of the Masque of Red Death that was going to be released on Blu-ray, and they had set a date, and it was going to be like in October. And I had come across this article, and I was like, "Oh yes, that's awesome!" And I ended up ordering it through Opera House Video, and it was pretty expensive when I got it. Um, but I still, even in my travels, I don't really see this movie in any of the shops. Whenever I'm like at Bull Moose, I don't. They have usually a bunch of other Roger Corman movies, particularly around his all of his other adaptations of Edgar Allan Poe stories. But for some reason, this is hard to find, and this was pretty expensive. It was like $30, but totally worth it. Totally awesome. The price has come down probably significantly for it now, but totally worth it. Just an amazing movie. I highly recommend anybody out there to see this movie, particularly if you get a chance to see it. This edition, it is uh, pure cinematic magic. So this is Jason Dean. Thanks again for your support, and we will see you next time. Peace.